Entertainah talking sports.
What is going on, football fans? Back at it with another New York Giants video as training camp is fast approaching. All the rookies, to my knowledge, reported yesterday. Today, players who sustained injuries last year will be reporting to camp, and that could be anybody. That could be Daniel Jones. That could be Saquon Barkley. Anybody that suffered an injury at any point in the season. The 27th will be the day that everybody will be attending training camp, and to my knowledge, from what I've read, the 28th will be the first day of practices for the New York Giants. So it looks like we're going to have about another week of dead time before things start to really pick up, and there's really some things to talk about regarding this year's season, how they're utilizing players in training camp, how these players are performing, and I can't wait to be able to really start to dive into this year's season. But being that it's kind of a slow time right now, one thing that I really wanted to talk about in this video was some of the players that are going to be free agents next year and some of the decisions that the New York Giants are going to have to make. Last year I made a video on this, and I knew going into the year Dalvin Tomlinson or Leonard Williams, they were going to have to choose one. At the time I predicted Leonard Williams. That is, of course, before we saw how they played on the football field, but I knew that one of them was going to have to be expendable. And right now we all know that the New York Giants going into next year are going to be strapped for cash. Word has come out that the max salary cap next year could be $208 million. Now, it may be less, but it can't exceed that number. My guess is it'll be around that number. This year, we all know that the New York Giants and every team in the league was strapped for cash, and the salary cap was $40 million less, or approximately $40 million less than initially anticipated before the pandemic occurred. So because of that, the New York Giants had to kick a lot of money down the line to be able to sign guys like Adoree Jackson, bring back guys like Leonard Williams, and sign guys like Kenny Golladay. They didn't have much of a choice, and I actually agreed with the philosophy this year due to the fact that Daniel Jones is on the third year of his rookie salary, and you have to start to be aggressive at some point and try to take advantage of a quarterback while he's on his rookie salary. The first 2 years, the New York Giants were kind of in rebuild mode, getting rid of contracts to try to, improve this roster via the draft, and then they tried to bring in some paid players to try to put this team over the top and make them a true contender from within the NFC conference. And we're going to have to wait and see how it all plays out this year. But I think it is as clear as day the New York Giants this year are going into this year based on what they did in the offseason, intending to compete, not just in the NFC East, but the NFC. You don't go out there and spend as much as the New York Giants did to have a moral victory season like they did last year. Last year, moral victories were acceptable. And it's what I expected. It's why I was lenient with the team. And by no means am I saying we're going to win a Super Bowl, but I expect this team to be competitive, and I expect this team, based off the things that they did, based off the growth from year one to year two with their head coach, to be able to compete with some good teams and beat some of them. Last year, we only really beat one strong team, and that was the Seattle Seahawks. I think this is a much better New York Giants football team this year, due in large part to some of the moves that they made. But one thing I wanted to talk about, and I saw a lot of people have been talking about this on Twitter. CBS Sports initially came out with an article that I think is complete clickbait, which is what you're going to get from the media. And I saw Bad Dog made a video on it. I haven't watched it because I didn't want his opinion to alter mine. But it's what you're going to get at this point in the offseason, and it's why I really haven't made a lot of videos, because there's not a whole lot to talk about, and I don't want to give you guys nonsense. To me, this is nonsense. And I'm going to explain why throughout this video. They named Jabrill Peppers a potential surprise summer trade, a player that could be traded in the summer, meaning before the season starts. And I'll explain why I think that's complete nonsense and why I don't see it happening. Now, conventional wisdom, and we're going to pull up the exact quote first, and then I'll give my full thought process, actually. This from GiantsWire.com regarding the article. He's still a big name with a big role, but with 2022 free agency on the horizon, Peppers could be dangled for a chance to gain $6.8 million in cap savings for a team with $2.4 million in cap space. It's not as if New York hasn't invested in alternatives at the position, paying up to retain Logan Ryan, recently spending a high pick on Xavier McKinney, and finding snaps for versatile Julian Love. Okay, so on the surface, I get it. Makes sense why the New York Giants could potentially look to trade Jabrill Peppers before the year starts, right? You've got a talented safety group. Even if you were to trade Peppers, McKinney, who, let's not guarantee he's going to be able to produce at the level that Jabrill Peppers can, right? Jabrill Peppers is a captain of this football team. He's one of the best players on the team last year when he was healthy, and over the second half of the season, he was a very good player for this New York Giants football team, and he fits the scheme very well, and in an ideal scenario, I would love to keep him. But on the surface, could it make sense? Sure. You're deep at that position. You don't know if you're going to be able to retain Jabrill Peppers after this year. The same thing happened with Landon Collins, so on and so forth. So, from that aspect, does it make sense that the New York Giants could look to trade him? Sure. But here's where it makes no sense to me whatsoever. Like I said at the top of this video, the New York Giants going into this offseason have clearly shown that they are all about trying to win this year. This is no longer about moral victories. This is no longer about rebuilding. And if you were to trade Jabrill Peppers, unless you were to trade him for a player, which I don't see happening, because if you look at this New York Giants roster, what do they really need? We need offensive line help. Well, what team would look to trade a good offensive lineman away from their team for a safety? I just don't see it. So if you're going to trade Jabrill Peppers before the season starts, it's more than likely for draft picks. And some people will say, well, look what happened with Landon Collins. We could have maybe gotten a second, if not a third round pick. Instead, we had to settle for the 99th overall pick with a comp pick because we let him walk the following year, which is what the New York Giants would ultimately get if Jabrill Peppers was going to get paid a lot of money at the end of this year and the New York Giants were not going to retain him. And people may say, well, you could get a second round pick for him. Well, in my opinion, based on how aggressive the New York Giants were this offseason, all the money they spent, wouldn't it be counterproductive to trade one of your best players on your defense in a year that you intend to compete for draft picks for next year? To me, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and it would make me question this entire offseason. When you're aggressive the way that the New York Giants were this offseason, you're intending to try to win as many football games as possible. And trading Jabrill Peppers for a draft pick before the season starts, to me, makes no sense whatsoever, even if it was a second-round draft pick. Listen, I would love to get as many draft picks as we possibly can, but at some point, the New York Giants have to start to focus on the here and now. And we don't know. They could still franchise tag Jabrill Peppers at the end of the year, and I'm going to go over the cap space next season and some of the things that the New York Giants could do, or they could let him walk for a comp pick. But regardless, I see no sense in trading him before the year starts. Now, if the Giants get off to a 2-5 start, a 1-6 start, and you want to make a trade at the deadline, by all means, if you don't think Jabrill Peppers is going to be in your long-term plans. Now, if you got a first-round pick, sure, you're not going to get a first-round pick, right? Jabrill Peppers is a free agent at the end of this year. Very rarely do safeties even get drafted in the first round. And as good of a player as Jabrill Peppers is, he's not the best safety in the league. So I wouldn't expect a first-round pick in return. So if what you're going to get back is a second-round pick, you more than likely would be able to get a second-round pick at the deadline anyway. So to me, it makes no sense. You go into this year with one of your best defensive players, your captain, and you see what this team is made of. You've been aggressive this offseason, and if the team falls apart, that's when you look to start to make moves like that. So to me, this article was complete clickbait. I see no reasoning before the year starts to trade Jabrill Peppers, and I hope he's part of the solution and long-term future with this football team. Of course, they're going to have to get creative and make some moves, which is kind of why I wanted to go over their salary cap next year. Next year, the salary cap, I think I stated at the beginning of the video, the max is stated to be $208 million. And according to Over the Cap, as of now, with the salary cap being in that range, the Giants would have about $2.5 million in cap space. Now, of course, there's some moves that the Giants could make, and I pulled up some of the names and some of the things. Sterling Shepard would save them $6.5 million if they were to cut him. He's due to make $10.5 million next year, $4 million on the dead cap hit, so it would save you $6.5 million. Devontae Booker's another possibility. He costs $3 million. He'd save you $1 million if you cut him. You could draft the running back. You could promote Brightwell to being the backup. There's things that you could do there. Kyle Rudolph would save you $5 million, and it may be a move that the New York Giants decide to do. He would cost you $7.25 if you kept him, $2.25 if you cut him, and the other one would be Riley Dixon, who carries almost no dead cap hit. He's a solid punter. He was a little bit underwhelming last year, but you'd save $3.275 million on a $3.75 million salary, and if you add all that money up, you're saving around probably about $17 million, and that's without small cuts, and that would bring you up to about $19 million on next year's cap. Now, of course, we saw it this offseason. There's ways that you could work around it. You could reconstruct your contracts. You could extend players, guys like Blake Martinez, guys like James Bradbury, if you intend for those guys to be in the long-term plans. But you don't want to kick the money down the curb too much, because the more that you do that, the harder it is to retain players on your roster, guys like Saquon Barkley, Daniel Jones. So I think the Giants have to take a smart approach going into the 2022 offseason with some of the things that they decide to do. But to me, there's no reason whatsoever for the New York Giants to look to trade Jabrill Peppers, unless, of course, they could better help this year's roster. Like I said, if you get an offensive lineman that would be a dramatic improvement on this line, sure, go ahead, have at it, being that you're so deep at that position to begin with. But I just don't see it happening. I also think in the Patrick Graham defense, what some people may not be realizing is they're going to use a ton of 3 safety sets, and they're going to be using Jabrill Peppers a lot in the box. He is very versatile, and he's one of the better fits for this defense. And like I said, he's a leader, he's a team captain, so on and so forth. In terms of some of the players that they're going to have to make decisions and why the future with the Giants for Jabrill Peppers after this year may look murky, there's a lot of free agents next year. And of course, a lot of this is going to depend on how they play this year. Lorenzo Carter. We all know Lorenzo Carter's coming off a major injury. We'll see how he responds this year, but I do think he's a very good schematic fit. BJ Hill. BJ Hill had a very good rookie season. He's probably going to get a more expanded role this year, and we'll see how he performs. Jabrill Peppers, Evan Ingram, who I think a lot of Giants fans would not mind if he were to leave, and he could be a potential trade target if we get off to a bad start, much like Jabrill Peppers at the trade deadline. And Will Hernandez. And Will Hernandez is a guy, at least in my opinion, that if he has a pretty good year, he's a guy that the Giants, for the right price, would try to keep here, right? We talk about continuity with the offensive line all the time. He's going to get an opportunity to start on the right side this year. He's a guy that Dave Gettleman obviously invested a very high pick in. So we'll see ultimately what they decide to do, but there's a lot of decisions they're going to have to make, and player performance is going to dictate what they decide to do. Do I think they'll let all those players walk? No. I think some of them will stay, but it is possible that Jabrill Peppers could be a cap casualty, and at that point, you would get a comp pick, but I'm not trading him before the year starts. There's no way in hell I'm doing that. And I think a lot of people, when they view this, they almost think of it as Madden, right? They don't think of it from the perspective of the general manager or the perspective of the head coach. These guys, they're competing for their jobs year in and year out. And I'm not saying that I think Joe Judge would get fired if the Giants won 5 or 6 games this year, but he would be immediately put on the hot seat going into his 3rd season. Dave Gettleman would be gone if this team underperformed. So based off the offseason that Gettleman had, how aggressive the New York Giants were, and knowing that this team more than likely needs to put forth a winning record, it makes no sense to me before the year starts to worsen this year's roster for Dave Gettleman if he intends to keep his job, and for Joe Judge if he intends to stay off the hot seat. And it's in Joe Judge's best interest for the New York Giants to either hire a GM from within or to keep Gettleman, because as you bring in outsiders, that puts him on the hot seat. At the end of the day, as much as I love Joe Judge, the NFL is a results-based driven business. If you don't win, you don't keep your job. And I'd be hard-pressed to find a coach that started his career with 3 losing seasons that stayed on with that team year 4. Judge knows eventually he's going to have to start winning football games. And this year, based off the things that the New York Giants did in free agency, I think it, built up the pressure a little bit more. There's higher expectations. So Jabrill Peppers, in my opinion, unless we're bringing in a player that better helps this team be a contender in 2021, will be a New York Giant week 1. Believe me. As always, guys, if you liked what you watched, please subscribe. Drop a comment. Maybe give me a little thumbs up. Cheers.